Thank you so much for this. We're all really appreciating it.
Well, you all may have figured out by now that I'm a bot created parametrically in some MIT computer by Mark. He conjures me up in this fashion. So, but needless to say, that can still be creative. So I've really been pleased to be a part of this thesis prep semester. I've really enjoyed collaborating with Mark, thinking about this. And of course, we had an immediate goal. We have this immediate goal, which is the thesis. And, you know, we want to get to an original question. There's professional credential involved. And that's great. And Heuretics is really good for that. The CAT, we've been using that as a generator. But there's really more to it. I mean, what we want to get to this is another step, a larger framework within which the CAT and Heuretics works. And this is really in the context of a larger purpose of education. I mean, the purpose of getting the degree, like we say about a degree, an advanced degree, you know, the master's in architecture, for example, it's a license to learn. So you go out, you graduate, you go out into the world, and the craft and the skills include these mental and theoretical and critical modes of thought that are just as important to you as your design skills and your computational abilities. And so I want to talk today about this larger framework within of Heuretics education, and I call it Mystory. I developed Mystory originally in a book called Teletheory. This is a book sort of heretically written, generating this Mystoriography, which is to electracy what historiography is to literacy. And the term Mystory in one word, is sort of after history and herstory. You might remember back to beginnings of feminism, and feminist critics and theorists were talking about herstory rather than history. And a major point that they made is that each person has his or her own specific history, and that there is no such thing as woman or man in general, but rather there are these singularities, these singular lives, each one, Arendt called it natality. This idea that each individual person, each one of you sitting there, is an opening, it's an opportunity in the world for something new to begin. And Mystory is a mode of education that gets at that kind of larger particularity. So I want to talk about that a little today in the context of electracy. Thinking about my project, you know, apparatus, the term apparatus, and some of you I know read French, and when you read apparatus theory, translated, the French theorists that we're talking about apparatus theory, we're using the term dispositif. This is a meaning, another translation of that would be a setup or a frame, like a Gestell, Germans would say, which really enables and also restricts what is possible to think and do and make. And we know all civilizations have a dispositif, and so do individuals. We want to figure out how to what this relationship is between the individual setup and the framing powers of the civilization. How do you really access that whole apparatus of your world? And there's kind of a shorthand for thinking about this and thinking about the history of education. When I was thinking about how to develop and electrate pedagogy, going all the way back to applied grammatology, a book that Mark has talked some about, I really had a very loose idea. I was looking into, specifically into creativity, because what I was interested in looking at the history of education is that literacy as a whole has kind of supported the left brain, the way that's described, analytical, the analytical word, verbal skills, and that there was another aspect of human intelligence which has been lumped in with the right brain. It's a little weak now. Our neuroscience tells us that these capacities are differentiated, but they kind of spread to the whole brain function, so we won't worry about too much about that, but just to get, as a sort of a loose metaphor to think about, what gets left out of education is this whole affective image, the holistic emotional side of our intelligence, and it is a part of our intelligence. And I was especially interested in that side of things because it gets left out of education, because education, as it's been structured within literacy, including all the way back to Plato's Academy, who was, we know famously in the Republic, he kicked the poets and the artists out of the city to make room for this more empirical kind of rational reasoning. But what Western education, we know that learning, the way disciplines are developed, is based on discovery. Their disciplines are created, and then verification. They're proven. There's evidence-based knowledge. What happens in Western education is a kind of exclusive attention to verification. So disciplines are taught not how they're created, they're taught from the point of view of their verification. After they've been invented, all the messiness of the invention process is dropped out. We just get the discipline after it's known. So for example, in physics, we sort of forget about the fact that Newton thought that his alchemy was as important as his observations of the heavens and his calculus. Kepler also was a magician in that sense, alchemist. Looked at astrology as much as astronomy. We sort of forget about that and just look at the physics part, look at the part that we now constitutes verification. But there's another dimension of intelligence, and as we say, and we know this in our whole learning process, sort of what we've been getting at in thesis prep, it's not just the verification or proof side of the thesis, but how do you invent one? How do you make one? And the making one is somewhat different from the proving of it or the executing of a plan or the calculating, simply filling out some sort of template. And we know this with human attention. So when you're problem solving, and that's the part that school really emphasizes, when you're problem solving, you have focused attention, you're analytical, working on a very clear set of parameters, and that's where we joked a little bit last week, but that's the sort of human consciousness that a drug like Adderall supports. But there's another side to human attention, which is called browsing. It's low focus, it's drifting, it's wandering, it's associated with reveries. Theorists like Bachelard, and it's kind of associative, sliding around, looking for it doesn't know what, dealing with the unknown. This is another kind of intelligence. And if there were a drug associated with it, we might say perhaps that's marijuana. Perhaps Colorado is onto something there from this kind of attention. But without getting into how it should be supported, the fact is that there's two types of attention equally important, or two sides of human intelligence: verification and discovery. Left brain, right brain. And so one way to think about, when I started thinking about electricity, was that, well, we're in the situation of hypertrophy of the left brain and atrophy of the right brain. And then one way to think about electricity is to say that it's the time now for, specifically how it relates to education, is that education needs to bring itself up to speed. It needs to have the whole brain, needs to have the whole range of human intelligence equally supported, specifically, not just leave creativity and discovery to chance or to luck, or hoping that somehow it'll take care of itself. But why not teach it from the beginning, include it in the teaching part? So with that sort of frame in mind, I was thinking, well, all right, so how do I bring this kind of discovery, this kind of low focus browsing, affective, imaging, holistic kind of experience of intelligence, how do we bring that into the learning process? And in some ways it was, the obvious place to look, because when you're thinking in apparatus theory, as we've talked before, grammatologically, we know that our civilization, since the Industrial Revolution, has developed these new technologies of recording. So, recording of sound, recording of image, telegraphy, all this, leading now into our digital situation is different from alphabetic writing. And specifically, as we say, we're moving from the word into imaging, I mean, in support in the apparatus. And the image associated with imagination, to think, well, this is the human capacity that, literacy supported, reason, the analytical dimension of intelligence, the propositional thought, proving true and false, verification, like we're saying. That's fine as far as it goes, but there's this other thing, the imagination, and the word itself, image, is in the imagination, this capacity of humans to imagine. And, we give a lot of lip service to that and everything, but, we don't teach it. We just say, well, go imagine something. Well, whatever that means. How would we bring that into education? So I started looking into the role of imaging, and specifically in creativity studies, of course, there's a huge amount of attention given to the image. And what especially attracted my attention was this notion of the image of wide scope. This historian of ideas, historian of science, Gerald Holton, it's his phrase, the image of wide scope, or I just call it the wide image. An image becomes wide in a certain way. What he had observed and supported, this has been supported in various kinds of more scientific studies, but he certainly observed it in the careers of the people that he studied, is that every person in there has a sort of core of 4 or 5 images at the very heart of their imagination, and that everything they do, any kind of experience, this would include everyday life, political and ethical behavior, and certainly in terms of problem solving, of working creatively, productively in their disciplines, they draw upon these 4 or 5 images and then a series of variations from them. He studied this in the careers of very successful, most productive people, and to figure out how it worked. And what I think was especially, his question was especially profound, that he was noticing that, one of the great mysteries of creativity is why do certain people make breakthrough discoveries and others don't, who are just as well prepared or even better prepared. So we would say someone like Poincaré knew the math, knew the physics, knew the science as well or better than Einstein, made some of the introductory discoveries that led to the theories that Einstein ultimately produced. But Einstein was the one that made the breakthrough. So why is that? And that's true across many fields. This is a mystery. Some people, why are some people capable of these breakthrough discoveries? And so Holton was very interested in this, and what he noticed is that these breakthrough discoveries, they're such a good model for understanding creativity in the larger sense, because the discipline itself is stopped. We would say here's an aporia in the disciplinary sense. It's at an impasse. The discipline methods themselves aren't enough. No matter how good a person is at the discipline, sort of doing normal science, as Thomas Kuhn would call it, that's not enough to make the discovery. And it's in situations like that that some people are able to draw upon their imaginations in new and unusual and unforeseeable ways. And the idea is that's a skill, that's a craft that some people are just more intuitively able to manage. And what Holton identified is that everyone has a disposition. You're born with it. Sort of propensity in your attitude towards reality that is nurtured and develops through your formative years. And this is the key, right, is that these formative years from infancy to 18, let's say, are just as important as your higher education, if not more so. And this is that natality idea of Arendt. One of these fundamental realities is that every to the world and begins as an infant and goes through a family, goes through culture, and what Holton was interested in was not only that cultural imprint. There's this idea we know from language. A person born in China speaks Chinese. A person born in the United States speaks American, and so on. A person born in France, and a human being has the capacity to speak any language. But as we know, whatever they're born into, then they pick that up as their native language, and you have to have done that by the time you're 5 years old, or it's very, very difficult to become proficient, become a speaker, speaking being. And the same is true of the imagination. That is, an imagination, a human being is born not with an active imagination, but with the capacity to imagine, and then is formatted, by these cultural experiences, the world you're born into. So there's this whole cultural dimension, nature and nurture. There's this nurture part, and sometimes we overlook the fact that people think, well, I grew up in South Georgia, and really, I never traveled anywhere, and I don't know anything, so I couldn't possibly accomplish much or whatever, or think what I accomplished you won't have anything to do with that. But that's really not the case at all. I mean, part of what the Mystory is interested in is learning how to tap that cultural resource. Anyway, whatever imagination you've got has been formatted, in California, it's been formatted in Beijing or wherever, and that's your power, that's your resource for this kind of larger, imaginative, intuitive thinking. And I think what especially interests me about Holton's work and the wide image is that, all right, in addition to that larger cultural frame, there is this disposition, this propensity of things. There's a certain way that an individual human being, you want the world to be. You want it to go in a certain way, sort of intuitively. And sometimes you don't even notice that there is this kind of directedness in your imagination. And when given the opportunity, when there's an aporia in the discipline, when given the opportunity, then the problem solvers, the really creative breakthrough thinkers, bring this, if you like to call it, your disposition, bring it to bear in the discipline and make it into an image of yourself in a certain sort of way, and that turns out to be the solution. So this is what I wanted to get at, talk a little bit more about how this works with Einstein. He's the prototype, and he kind of personifies genius in this romantic sort of way. And what I like about Mystory is, well, it's not genius in any, or only saying that the original meaning of genius is that's your nature. The person's nature meaning that's your disposition, that's your personal setup, if you like, your personal dispositif that enables and also restricts what is possible for you to do and imagine. And so the way it works, and there's many studies of this now, and I can, we look at references, we can, get some other links, but just to say how it went for Einstein. So he had this memory, and it was a memory that he had in his biography, and he told this story a number of times. Very strong memory from his childhood. When he was 4 or 5 years old, his father came home from a business trip or whatever and gave him a present. And the present was a compass. And just a little, pocket compass. And what fascinated, and here's a key word, what Einstein reported he was fascinated by as a child was no matter how he manipulated this little device, that the needle north, and he couldn't shake it. The needle had its own will, so to speak, its own power of designating this one direction. And he always remembered that. And of course, at the time that this happened, when Einstein's 4 or 5 years old, is the principles of electromagnetism weren't understood. I mean, they knew they existed, they're being studied, but that the physics of that was not understood. And if you like, destiny, I mean, Einstein is the one whose physics ultimately solved that puzzle and addressed that issue within physics as electromagnetism, an electromagnetic field. And so there's this kind of interesting symmetry between this childhood anecdote and the career breakthrough. And Holton, now analyzes the image. Say, all right, we're really talking literally about an image in the poetic sense. That is, an image has two parts, right? A vehicle and a tenor. The vehicle is the physical part. That's the compass, the needle, and then Holton called it the themata. We might say the signified or the tenor, which is more the spiritual, the meaning of the thing. And for Einstein, say that was the invariant principle. This idea that there is this sort of disposition, is this idea that there's got to be something, some Archimedean point, some fixed position that allows you to figure things in the world. And ultimately, he fills in that slot in his physics with the speed of light. So the speed of light is it's the invariant principle. There's kind of symmetry, this match up when he gets to his career discipline with this figure from his imagination. And it's not that the compass causes this structure to appear, but rather, is the causality of Einstein's imagination, but rather, the idea is that, like a work of art for a culture or for people, this image that appears in these anecdotes allows this disposition to crystallize, to format, to give it a language, so to speak. It takes a capacity which is itself inchoate, intuitive, and brings it in, crystallizes it, brings it into appearance, makes it more accessible, and the imagination starts playing with this figure. And this is the idea in general, so that your imagination, you look at any of these accounts of child psychology, Piaget or whatever, and the idea is that not only are you learning a language, but also you're into your environment, in your home, going outside, a certain kind of village or town or city. Maybe you're riding subways, or maybe you're riding your bicycle to the outskirts of town or whatever. And the idea is that the child internalizes that configuration, if you like, that place or that position, or even that quorum, we might call it. And then within their imagination, they're able to start manipulating the world. That is, they can use that site, that scene, which is quite peculiar, quite specific to them, almost like like you've seen children's books. One of the things children's love in books are like, there'll be a map, there'll be a place, 100-acre woods, Winnie the Pooh, or the meadow where the little breezes went off, played in the Mother West Wind series, or these various stories. There'll be a map, and Uncle Remus stories. There'll be these places. Here's the well where the fox fell in, or over here, and or a board game, shoots and ladders and things. And there's this kind of world that is internalized, and then the imagination predicts things, how things are going to happen, begins to plan and so forth by means of this kind of world, which is quite specific, to each individual person. So the Mystory, the idea is to get at this image-wide scope, sort of, is an idea about how this can be put to work, and so it has these parts. So it's like the vehicle and the tenor, and there's kind of a way of harnessing destiny or fate, you might say, as it used to be understood, back in pre-modern times. So I wanted to give a couple of architectural examples, architects who have this kind of configuration. And remember, still kind of an early part of this account, because right now we're noticing retrospectively, right? We understand, like with heuretics, with the cat, it can be used analytically, and it can be used generatively. And right now we're talking about the kind of analytical part. So there's many studies where there's this connection between some childhood anecdote that the productive person, creative person remembers, and then, well into their career, or historians find it, or, critics observe it, or even retrospectively or introspectively, the creator, him or herself, will talk about this. So one of the cases of Frank Gehry has been studied in this way, and Frank, his grandparents lived with his grandparents. They emigrated from Poland to Canada, lived in Toronto for a while, then moved to a smaller town in Canada, and they were observing their Jewish traditions. On Thursday, Frank would go with his grandmother to the market. He's, say 10 years old, something like that. She would buy a carp, bring it home, and they put it in the bathtub, and his carp would swim around in the bathtub all day, and Frank loved to watch it. He'd sit for hours and watch this fish swimming around the bathtub. He loved it. He was fascinated by it, and this is a key to note here. Like Einstein's fascinated with the compass and the movement of the compass. There's kind of a gesture there, and then Gehry is fascinated, entranced, intrigued by the movement of this fish in the bathtub. And of course, then the next day, fish is gone, it's served, Sabbath, supper, filter fish, and so that's part of the ritual. So in this case, it's not an individual incident. Like Einstein remembered the incident, punctual moment when he got the compass. In this case, it's a ritual. It happened many times, in Gary's case. And we know that in his profession, I mean, he's famous for these fish sculptures that he made. But of course, the fish gesture is not literal. It can be in his sculptures, but in something like the Guggenheim, it's the quality of movement that we're talking about, which is that sort of swimming movement, that sort of curving gesture that the critics have noticed has this quality. It's a very loaded image. And again, the issue is, well, Gary is a breakthrough designer. I mean, he's thinking that gesture before the computers can design it, before it's buildable, breaking from, the orthogonal lines into these curves. That's his disposition. He already wants the world to be that way. And when he gets an opportunity, he makes it happen. And not only that, but there's this even part of his story is that in a smaller town in Canada where they lived, he was subject to anti-Semitic slurs, and in fact, he was called a fish. He smelled like a fish. I mean, it was an insult. It was this kind of very ambivalent, dark side of that image. But it's a very powerful feature of his creative story. He can jump from, this childhood thing, and then he does this breakthrough designer. So there's still a big gap in there, and that's what we want to get to. But another example, Renzo Piano, I mentioned him last week. Renzo Piano reported 2 childhood memories that he did it in the context in interviews he gave, talking about his imagination, and he was saying that he all kind of in his disposition, right? He loves a sort of immaterial element, wind, light, these kinds of qualities of sensory qualities of the environment, and he associated that immateriality with two memories. One was Genoa, growing up in Genoa, and he neighborhood streets of Genoa and seeing the laundry hung out, especially the sheets are hung out on the line, and they're flapping in the breeze, and people would do this all the time, and he really loved that gesture, that movement of the sheets hanging on the lines. And the other memory is on Sundays he would go to the harbor with his father there in Genoa, and they would watch the sailing ships out in the harbor. And again, so we're seeing the same thing as the sails, and Renzo would say that he imagined these larger ships as moving buildings. Somehow they moved against and with these forces. So when we get to the themata of these vehicles, of these images, Piano's words were lightness. He had this feeling of lightness overcoming a gravity, that a building is this kind of fight or against gravity. That's a very fundamental experience. I mean, this is when childhood psychologists talk about one of the greatest achievements of any human being is when you stand up, whatever age, 1 year old, so you stand up and walk. That you never get over that's like one of the greatest triumphs of being human. And so that we experience that fundamental posture of that gesture. And so, critics have observed this kind of flying carpet roof, say, that's mentioned in the modern wing of the Art Institute of Chicago, but that other features of his designing have this gesture. So this kind of, what the white image gets at, a lot of these anecdotes, they've studied Beethoven and Darwin and Tesla and Virginia Woolf and, many of these cases make this connection analytically and retrospectively. So you look at the career of a person, after they've been very productive, and then you can find these connections with early childhood, that you can see that in the childhood there's a disposition to that recurs in the career, and that these two are connected, and that part of being creative sort of the cliche of creativity studies. I know you've seen it. They say that the creative people are those who somehow retain their connection with childhood. That they can tap that inner child, or the child remains a part of their experience, their imagination when they're adults. That's a cliche, and it's a truism, if you like. And the wide image really, gets at more analytically the importance and the reality of that sort of thing. So this is what we're trying to get at here. And so when I was looking at this theoretically, this was the question, as a for the pedagogy, you say, all right, so what if instead of waiting till the end of your careers, you go out, you leave MIT, you go out in the world, and 30 years from now, people are looking at your body of work, and they say, well, you fell off the barn, when you were 5, and whatever. And, they make this connection. And so, but my interest would be to say, well, what if we could, as part of the learning education process, if we could introduce the wide image now? I mean, before, while you're at the very beginnings of your disciplinary work, if we introduced it now, how would that work? What if we could take that into account? What if you could make that part of your toolkit, so to speak? The craft of your license to learn would be that you would be able to understand and access your imagination in this sort of theoretic way. And so what I was thinking about was what would I have to do to fill out that gap, between early childhood, these memories, these anecdotes, and the career. And to make that transition, I was thinking about, we've talked a little about theopraxesis in here. I think Mark has talked about that, which is this idea of knowing, doing, and making. That we have to think about all these 3 dimensions of our human capacities together. They happen together. They work integratively. And specifically also this idea of how the individual taps the resources of his or her civilization. So like when you speak language, what the philosophers say is you don't speak language. Language speaks you. I mean, you're inside language, and what is possible to do and think and say, is partly, determined even probably 90% by what language allows. And that's true of design and history. And so the Mystory is a way to tap that whole civilization. It's the microcosm-macrocosm relationship. That we're concerned not only with GPS, or where you are physically, but EPS, the existential positioning system. Kind of not only the physics, but the metaphysics is a very important part of an individual being able to harness the resources of his or her civilization, of his or her apparatus, and make it work, make it perform, fulfill this dispositional dream that each one is capable of. So I was looking for models, and in pre-modern civilization, people said, well, pre-modern people knew where they were, whether they were in the Eastern world or in the Western world. And the Western version of this is probably the culmination of it is in Dante's Divine Comedy, but it kind of informed Western civilization from the ancient world through till the Renaissance at least, or even 17th century, even science broke free. But the idea is that there's this typological allegory, and it had 4 levels, but especially in Christian world, as we say, Dante's Divine Comedy shows it. And the first level was history. I thought it was history, and it was recorded in the Old Testament. So it was a story in the Old Testament, the Bible, major stories. Israel comes out of Egypt. So that's the history story. We call this the pop cycle. There's this cycle of levels, these different institutional discourses that each person learns or is initiated into. Second level was the New Testament story. Typologically, the New Testament story, this is called the allegory, literally the allegory, repeats the Old Testament story. That is, the life of Christ fulfills the prophecy of the Old Testament. And so, the resurrection is like Israel comes out of Egypt, Christ dies and resurrected. So those 2 stories typologically fulfill one another, they repeat one another. And you see this homological, isotopical repetition up through the levels. So the third level is the moral level. This is the level of the individual Christian believer, what that individual person does to accomplish salvation. So in the individual life of the believer, accomplishing, living for salvation, repeats the other two stories, and then finally called the anagogical level, and I love that word, anagogical, is this kind of redemption of the world at the end of time. The whole historical movement of time is progressing in a line from beginning to end towards world redemption. So those four stories are the same four stories, and an individual person in that world, in that pre-modern world, could figure where he or she was, their existential position system, according to this, where they were in the progress of the story. And the modernists have said, well, that was great to have an allegorical structure like that. We don't have that system anymore. We don't know where we are, after the death of God, so to speak, or in or nihilistic or mono-level culture. So we still have people telling allegories like Kafka. It's just that they don't have any meaning. It's like you're missing several levels of the story that help you figure out where you were. So what I did with the Mystory, I said, well, all right, we still actually have this sort of structure. There is still this connection between the microcosm and the macrocosm, the individual moral life of what was the believer, the anagogical level. But it's been flipped over. And now it's grounded not in this anagogical story of history, but it's mystorical. That is, it's grounded in the individual, singular, particular life of the one person, and distributed across the whole of humanity. Whoever wants to practice this form potentially, so I call it the pop cycle. And I want to walk through it here now. I'm going to use a particular case study, Maurice Sendak, to go through the four steps, so that we added between your career. Let's take your career as an anagogical one. The anagogy is now provided not by this whole religious belief system, but is provided by your individual, in your case, architecture. Architecture is anagogical for you, meaning that career provides you an account of how the whole world works. It's metaphysical in that sense. And of course, there's your individual story. And we want to move in between those other steps, to see the pattern that will show us this disposition, that will show us this image of wide scope, which is working within us willy-nilly, whether we want it to or not. The trick is to learn how to harness it, direct it, access it, augment it, put it to work in our own best interest. So I want to use Maurice Sendak. We'll go through this. And the idea is to think about how Sendak does it. I did my own Mystory. It's online. I can send you the URL. My students have done, many students for decades have done these things. And they're pretty interesting. They're pretty fun. They're pretty aesthetic, worth looking at in their own right. The idea is to have you think about, as a framework, not directly maybe in your thesis now, but in this larger sense. This is something you might want to journal about. You might want to think about it to see how you might fill in some of these slots for yourself. So I'll just identify what they are in this kind of pop cycle for Mystory with Sendak. And just to remind you, Maurice Sendak was identified, he passed away not too long ago, but he was considered to be one of the two top authors of children's stories in the 20th century in America. So Maurice Sendak, and the author of Where the Wild Things Are is the most famous one. The other top one is Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss, Maurice Sendak. I think in the context of Mystory, it's kind of appropriate to talk about a children's author in this setting. Where the Wild Things Are, that was published in 1963. Spike Jonze adapted it to a film in 2009, so you may have seen that. But in any case, so the first step is the family story. So think about, just like we saw with piano or Geary, or Einstein. So there's this family memory. You might think about this in your own case. And to do it methodologically, it's just a matter of reflecting for 5 minutes just to see what's in your memory. Because part of the issue here is, how does memory work? And you know, we know that along with imagination, memory and imagination, these go hand in hand. These work together. In fact, Proust said he didn't trust anything that he saw directly. He had to pass through his memory first before he could even experience or understand or address it. So memory is a very important part here. And in thinking about creativity as opposed to verification, this is what the Mystory is really kind of pedagogy for creativity and imagination. You know, memory, you know, the weird thing is like how do inventors, you know, put together things that don't normally seem to go together? I mean, that this is sort of breakthrough things. Oh, who would have thought of that? And so it's such a surprise when this invention, you know, appears. Well, it turns out that memory doesn't work like the Library of Congress. I mean, it doesn't work like the Dewey Decimal System as a way of classifying materials, but rather the memory gathers things according to their affective shared tone, their emotional tone, so that it'll put things together that, you know, don't go together in any you know, literate classification system, but that emotionally are associated, kind of like those levels of the allegory you're talking about. So you think about this in your memory, what pops up? You know, it might not be right on the surface, but after, you know, 5 or 10 minutes of thinking about it, there'll be something there. There'll be something like the compass or something like the glowing laundry. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be any big thing. It's not any big secret, like some terrible thing or some huge thing, but just some everyday life bit, some fragment that you recall. And and Sindak had a couple of these. One that when he was very small, couldn't read yet. He had an older sister, and his sister belonged to a book club. She would get these books, and that was fine. But one day, the book that came in the mail for her book club was this big, fat book. It was the big, fattest book, thickest book that Maurice had ever seen. And it was cloth back, you know, hardbound cover. It was this pale green color. You remember it vividly. He's fascinated by it. And here's the thing. He was fascinated by it. All these other books had passed through, but there was this one that fascinated him, and he wanted it. And he kicked up such a fuss that finally the parents made the sister give him the book just to bring peace. And so she did, you know, reluctantly. And he couldn't read it yet, but he would pretend to read, you know, like little kids do when they're just learning, you know, turn the pages. He'd wait a little while, however long he thought it would take to believe that he read it, turn another page. He pretended to read it. And he loved it so much he licked it all over. He licked it all over so it kind of ruined the cover, all bent and everything. Finally gave it back to his sister because it had lost some of its beauty. So he really remembered that book. And there was another memory, and it's a vivid memory, you know, that's still in his mind, you know, years later when he was talking about his own life. He lived in Brooklyn, and there was a neighbor girl, older girl again, named Rosie, and she was a great storyteller, and, you know, out in the steps of the brownstone or whatever, and, you know, she'd tell neighborhood kids these stories. And Rosie had a grandmother, and the grandmother must be loved, and she would go out and get, you know, shop every day, come back with a bag of groceries. Everybody loved her, she was really nice and everything. And one day Rosie came out and said her grandmother had died, she passed away. Everybody was heartbroken, it was very sad and everything. And she was giving all these details and stuff. And then the grandmother came walking up the street with a bag of groceries again, just like every day. She'd made it up. Like, Frank couldn't believe it. He said, "You can do that?" I mean, Maurice didn't say that. You can do that? You can just make stuff up. So that you remember that very, very vividly. So that's the first step. You see, all right, you just document that, put that into your allegory, into your system, your pop cycle. Go to the next level. The next level is that's what we're looking for. Is we're looking for a pattern, because the idea of the white image is that if something has remained in memory, it's captured in some way. This fascination is captured in some way. This disposition, this dispositif, this setup that is how you want the world to be intuitively and natally, you might say. So the next level is called entertainment. You can call it mythology. You might say that first one, that family story, is like your oral one. So every person really has orality, literacy, and electricity, you know, built in to their everyday life experience. You know, in the families, when you learn your native language, you pick up lots of other nurture stuff, ethnicities and religions and so on. So then you go to the next level, and the next level is entertainment. And now, certainly in the modern day, you know, into your home through television, you know, VCRs, radio, you know, back earlier, and now, of course, the internet, in comes electricity. And from very young age, in fact, this is a big concern, right, in our civilization, that the pediatricians warn, you know, don't let children under 2 have more than an hour of screen time a day, because it's gonna, you know, modify their brains and make them, you know, illiterate, incapable of literacy, really, but perhaps more capable of literacy. But in any case, so in comes entertainment, and the key here is to say that entertainment, you know, these narratives that, you know, these movies, what you want to think about here is like, well, what movie, but it could be certainly a book, it could be a children's story, that would be the case. It could be a radio program, it could be a video game, you know, depending on, you know, what generation one is, but the idea is this: come into the world and come into your home, and the thing is, it's like a Trojan horse in there, or it's representing a completely different system of values. It's got a different ideological structure. It works with a different kind of logic, and this is good, right? You become a native speaker of your language, your native language in your home, and then dealing with entertainment, you become a native speaker, so to speak, of this other dimension of culture, and so again, Sindak remembered very well a particular movie that he saw that had a huge impact on him, as it did on many people, and that is The Wizard of Oz. And one of the things I like about the example of The Wizard of Oz is that when I was reading this interview with Sindak, I'd also read Salman Rushdie's book. Salman Rushdie did the British Film Institute Introduction to The Wizard of Oz, and Rushdie was a child in India, in Bombay, and he saw The Wizard of Oz, and he was knocked out by it, and claims it had a huge influence on midnight children, and so on. So it's like, in a way, there's this global dimension to this electorate part. I know I had a graduate student who grew up in Russia, the Soviet Union, actually, in the 1980s. She was talking about the huge impact when the family got a VCR. You know, before the Soviet Union broke up, got a VCR, started watching American movies at home. It's like, wow, it's like a revolutionary experience. But so you find this work of entertainment, we call it that, the mythological work, narrative, story, you know, communicating the visions of the culture, and you know, you think about it, remember that, you might want to look at it again, but there'll probably be a couple of scenes. It won't be the whole thing, you're not documenting the whole thing, but rather you document, you put into your Mystory, you document those scenes that you remember, just like the scenes from childhood. You don't document your whole childhood, but rather you tell these particular anecdotes of memory. And in the same case here, what did you remember? And there were two related scenes that Sindak remembered. And the first is Dorothy, you know, is played by Judy Garland in The Wizard of Oz. And, you know, I can't assume people know The Wizard of Oz, that story. But in any case, she's trapped by the wicked Witch of the West. You know, that she begins in Kansas, there's a tornado, she gets locked out of the tornado cellar, she's in her home, in her bedroom, and the whole house gets lifted off the ground and blown to this other world called Oz. And so anyway, she's separated like that from her home, and the Wicked Witch of the West has trapped her, and the Wicked Witch of the West has an hourglass, and she turns the hourglass over. It's a motion, that turning of the hourglass over. And she says, when the time runs out, you are dead. Says the Wicked Witch of the West. And Sindak, you know. And what he remembered was, again, he said, and so Dorothy brings her hand up to her head, and her hand is shaking like this. She says, I'm frightened. And again, so I think this is one of the things I always suggest people look at. It's like, what is the motion in there? What movement, what action, you know, the billowing of the sheets, or, you know, compass needle or whatever, look for that in the scene, because we're interested in the signifier. We're not so much interested in the signified right away. Then the other scene's related. So the idea is that Dorothy is in Oz and her family's in Kansas, and there's this crystal ball, and Dorothy in the crystal ball, again, she's with the witch or something, and she sees her Auntie M is looking for her, calling Dorothy, where are you? And Dorothy yells at the crystal ball, Auntie M, here I am. But there's this huge separation, and his feeling was frustration. He says that no one could help Dorothy as a child. He's feeling this huge frustration, and that's part of what you look at and say, well, what is the emotion? What am I feeling in relationship to this story? Similarly with the anecdote of childhood and a family member. What is the feeling? Because that's the dimension of intelligence that we're kind of tracking here, like the sensorial, the emotional track. Then there's the third level of the allegory, and that's a community history. Now this is a little more difficult because now you're thinking of yourself positioned in the community. What is its history? What does the community remember? But again, you see the structure. The structure is, first of all, that in each of these levels, whether it's the family itself, whether it's entertainment, and when you get to the community, is like you're inside it. It's not inside you. Or this inside-outside is sort of excellent, as Lacan would say. So the movie is stripped. The inside comes outside, circulates back through. When it's larger than you, it's prior to you, and it's got a position for you. This is called interpolation in theories, Althusser, right? That is, you are hailed by the community. It says, here, come take up this position. In the home, like in the family, maybe the dad wants you to be a quarterback, or the mom wants you to be a dentist, or here, take up this position and be what we want you to be. And there's this pressure already. In the entertainment story, there's an ideological position. Here, take up this position of individual causal agent. This is the way we believe in the West that that things happen. Individuals take responsibility and they're able to change the world all by themselves. That's an ideological position. Same in the community history. In America today, there's a position for you. We want you to be a productive member of money-making member of society, paying taxes and buying tons of crap at Christmas time. And that's the position that's it's offered to you. But what you want to know of this community story is, what does your community remember? What stories does it tell about itself? And you want to notice that even if it isn't something you yourself identified with so much. I grew up in eastern Montana, a county named after General Custer, and so my community remembers Custer, this, Indian fighter massacred, not far from my home, Custer's last stand. No, I don't know if I identify with that, but my community certainly does. I have to acknowledge that, and acknowledge that before I was thinking critically, I had internalized that whole story of the cavalry and the settling of the plains and Indian wars, and that's part of who I am. That's part of my imagination. That's formatted my creativity. And like you say, though, everything is a compass. It's like the needle points north, but it doesn't mean you have to go north. It can go in any direction. So in some ways, the image-wide scope is a compass. All of them are a kind of compass. So this community history. And the community, it can be a hometown, but it can be the whole nation, or it can be a religious group, or it can be an ethnic group, it can be a racial community but the idea is to look at some hero, some protagonist of that community, just like there's a protagonist of the entertainment story, Dorothy, or there's characters in your family story. And the one that Sindak remembered in his account, his own life account in this way, was actually a national figure. It was an event that happened was very little, but it was the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. Some of you may know in American history, Charles Lindbergh was the first American, that first person to fly a solo flight across the Atlantic. So he flew from New York to Paris solo in the spirit of St. Louis. And so he's very famous as a young man. And then his wife and had the baby, and the baby was kidnapped. Obviously, ransom or whatever, and murdered. So this is a huge event, and Sindak remembered it, and he specifically remembered a newspaper article that had the scene of where the body of the baby had been found. It had this big black arrow pointing, couldn't hardly see anything. It's grainy, it's black and white newspaper photo of this black arrow was pointing to the site of where the baby had been found. So those were the three levels, and then there's the career, but we'll say Sindek becomes a writer of children's stories. But you have the family, the entertainment, the historical community level, and you see we've got these three anecdotes, we've got these three different narratives stacked up, and the idea is that they typologically relate somehow, that they pick up particularly on a certain image and a certain emotion, a certain tone of feeling that gets at and captures this image of wide scope, this disposition, this setup, which you as an individual have. Now, Sindek's own interpretation of this pattern for himself was, in thinking about his own career, he said that that what so terrified him and so moved him, specifically, and you can see the pattern was like say the Lindbergh baby cases, that to be in your bedroom, which is the safest place in the world, and suddenly to be abducted and ripped out of there and taken away and killed, that this is just unthinkable. That shift, from safety to absolute vulnerability and fragility was very powerful for him. And you can see it again in Dorothy. She's in her bedroom, and suddenly, the tornado blows her into this completely other world, and she's separated from her family, from her mother. And so he was saying that the feeling was that this relationship between the child and the mother is absolutely close, and yet existentially it may be like Kansas and Oz, completely, infinitely separated. It was that tension that he was getting at, felt that he was expressing. And so we say, so his wide image, now he himself doesn't go into the wide image, he just talked about it historically, but he didn't finally pick out a specific image, but we could say that because he was saying, when he was describing his career, he said all of his stories, and you think where the wild things are, starts in the child's bedroom. He's had a fight with his mother, discipline problem or something, he's been bad, and there's this transformation from the bedroom scene into this other world, Oz-like world, full of these monsters, which ultimately he tames and so on. But Sindek was saying many, many, many stories, but they're all that story. They're all that story of that closeness and separation. When he saw that his imagination had been completely formatted and crystallized into that particular story. So if you think about building his wide image, because that's the next step, right? You develop your Mystory, you go through these three, or you might even want to include your career story in the same way. That is, who is the protagonist in the field of architecture for you? But you line up, you find the homology, and then you make an emblem. You make an emblem which can show to yourself kind of like a sort of personal brand, rather than wearing a Budweiser T-shirt or an MIT sweatshirt or whatever. It's like instead of taking somebody else's brand, in a sense, you're putting out your own sense of identity, expressing your own values. And so you make this emblem to kind of bring into form, make appear, render visible this position. So we could say, where would Sindek go with that? I mean, in terms of picking the actual vehicle, the actual image, the equivalent of the compass or something, he would have to do it, right? Let's say, as an analyst, I might say something like the crystal ball, or perhaps even, the red slippers and the red shoes that Dorothy wore in Oz, because those red shoes given to her by the good witch, the East, were magical and helped protect her. Something like that for the image to evoke that. But then, and here's where we get to Holton called the themata, I would say the vehicle, the tenor part of the image. And this is interesting too, because it's the invariant principle for Einstein. This is sort of where you start getting at what your disposition is really telling you to do. I mean, as a guide, as a director, the spiritual dimension. And here's where we get into theopraxesis, because because we discover that the wide image, as we say, it's your kind of personal metaphysics, and it has three parts, really composed of three questions, and these three questions help you identify what that invariant principle is for your compass. And the first question is, we would call the theory question or the knowledge question, is how does the world work? What is reality? How does it work? And the idea is that you don't impose on this like, well, what do I think about that? How do you know, but rather you let the Mystory tell you. And part of the methodology, the heuristics of this is one story can answer one question. So, and only one. Doesn't matter which one you choose. You can use the history story, you can use the entertainment story, you can use the family story to answer one of these questions, but you can only use it once. So if we're looking at Sindak, you would say, how does the world work? And I think in his case, we would say that that the story that most shows how he thinks the world works, and it's you, it's right, what you think, it's not what I don't know, some scientist thinks, but you personally, how does the world work? And that would be the Lindbergh kidnapping. The idea is that there is no safe place. That's the reality that I have to deal with. There is no safe place. So that's his metaphysics. That's how the world is. So then you go to the second question. You say, all right, given that there is no safe place, what is your morality? Meaning, how should I behave? How do you think you should behave? Given that there's no safe place, how should you behave? You know, and there's no right answer here. It's just, you know, what do you think? What's your idea? And this is where you get into praxis, right? This is your morality. This is your ethics, your politics. You know how to behave. And again, you don't impose. You let the story tell you, what the answer is here. And here I think it would be the Wizard of Oz. There's the Wizard of Oz shows Sindak his morality, meaning that confront your fears. And here I'm thinking especially, remember that Dorothy in Oz meets these companions and picks up these companions, each one lacking some major virtue. You know, the lion is cowardly. The Tin Man has no heart, and the Scarecrow has no brain, lacking some feature, and they don't just give up. They confront that, and through their behavior, they acquire guts, heart, feeling, and mind, reason. So that's sort of the expression of how you should behave. So given there is no safe place, the way you should behave is to confront your fears, overcome your lack, through action. And then there's a third question, and the question is of mood. So given that there's no safe place, and that you feel that you have to overcome your fears and confront that fragility of life, how do you feel about that? And again, there's no right answer, right? Cynical, giddy, morose. What is the mood in which you undertake these actions in such a world? And this is poesis. This is the aesthetic dimension, the attitudinal aesthetics dimension of your experience. And I think then there's only one that has to come from Reese. It has to come from his family. That's the only option left. And indeed, I think we would say, like the way he described his feeling in these situations, is that is a terrible beauty. It's like it's excruciating, it's frustrating, but it's also extremely beautiful. Kind of like Rosie telling the story of her grandmother. You can overcome this, and so I would say he has kind of a blues feeling. It's like happy to be feeling sad. This is what he discovered through his art, is that he can take the most terrible experiences and make this profound expression of the joy of life out of them. So that would be, his themata, that would be his individual personalized metaphysics, his theopraxesis, which is to say, within his life, there is this integrated combination. You can't, you have a default, which is your disposition. So what's interesting about the Mystory is the way to develop the wide image at the beginning of your career is that it's possible to formulate for yourself this account of your own worldview. And of course, it's a compass, right? It doesn't dictate, it's not fate, but it's a way to imagine your own experience, and especially as an independent thinker. Because when you go out the doors of MIT with the degree, you go out into the world, you're going to be looked at, it's going to be assumed that you're an independent thinker, an agent, and you need to have some craft at behaving in that way, taking responsibility for your own invention and creativity. So that's what I think the larger framing of the, like L.L. Mark's ambitions for a thesis prep is, first of all, you need to take care of that job of writing, getting control of the, of your arguments for generating a really good, functioning thesis. But there's this larger sense of the educational purpose of MIT. I mean, MIT, I think, was granted the first professional degree in architecture in America. It was in the middle of the 19th century, very first one. And the reason why it still has the thesis course, I think, the reason why it still has the thesis and other schools don't, is that it feels this larger purpose of its education. It's not only vocational or, in that sort of sense, but it's educational, this larger liberal arts kind of way of taking responsibility for one's whole life and not just for one's craft. And that's what's been exciting for me in talking with you about heretics as a way to help get at that. And I know that these ideas fall upon very rich soil there at MIT in a class like this. So that is the image wide scope, Mystory as a kind of heretics, and we'll see. We'll follow your careers and see if it works. Thanks.
Wonderful.